Welcome to the Pride Channel, your home for all things queer news, history, and pop culture. There's something uniquely heartbreaking about the life of Anthony Perkins because, from the outside, he seemed to have everything. He was handsome, talented, intelligent, sophisticated, and one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood horror history. To audiences, he became immortal as Norman Bates in Psycho. Nervous smile, awkward charm, and all. But behind that iconic performance was a man spending most of his life terrified that the world would discover who he really was.
It's funny how something in people's memories locks in forever.
Yeah, it's true. They talk about the two Psycho films, there's no question about it.
What makes Perkins' story so tragic is that it feels almost impossible to separate the man from the character that made him famous. Norman Bates was isolated, anxious, deeply repressed, and emotionally trapped. And while Perkins himself was nothing like Norman in terms of violence or instability, there's an eerie sadness in how much emotional repression existed in both of their lives. Hollywood in the 1950s and 1960s was brutal toward queer actors. Studios controlled everything: who you dated, where you appeared, how you dressed, even the way you spoke in interviews. Being openly gay could end a career instantly. Actors lived in constant fear of gossip columns exposing them, and studios often arranged fake romances or heavily managed public images to protect their investment. Perkins grew up and entered fame in exactly that world.
Do you go out with friends?
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
Before Psycho, he was actually viewed as a rising romantic leading man. He had this soft, intellectual energy that made him stand out from the tougher, hyper-masculine stars of the era. Critics loved him, directors loved him, audiences were fascinated by him. But privately, Perkins was reportedly struggling with his sexuality from a young age. He had relationships with men, including actor Tab Hunter, though these relationships remained hidden from the public. And secrecy like that changes a person. Imagine living every day knowing one wrong photograph, one rumor, or one careless comment could destroy everything you had worked for. That kind of fear becomes permanent. It sits in your body.
I think I've talked to you all I want to.
Yes, but
I think it'd be much better if you left now. Thanks.
One of the saddest parts of Perkins's life is the way shame seemed to follow him everywhere. By many accounts, he genuinely believed something was wrong with him because of the culture he grew up in. This was an era where homosexuality was treated as immoral, criminal, sinful, or psychologically broken, depending on who you ask. Hollywood reflected those attitudes perfectly. Perkins reportedly underwent conversion therapy in an attempt to change his sexuality. Just thinking about that now is painful. The idea that someone so gifted and sensitive was made to feel he needed to erase a core part of himself just to survive is devastating. Reports about electroshock treatments and psychiatric cures paint a picture of someone desperately trying to fit into a world that refused to accept him as he was.
Doesn't that kind of disprove your theory about civilization? I mean, if people can take something up like that and not only say, oh, wouldn't that be crazy, or wouldn't it be fun, but to develop a skill, I think there's hope for civilization.
Oh, okay, well.
And then there's Psycho itself, the role that made him legendary but also trapped him forever. When Alfred Hitchcock cast Perkins as Norman Bates, it changed horror cinema permanently. His performance is still unsettling today because it feels so human. Norman isn't a monster in the traditional sense. He's vulnerable, lonely, shy, and painfully awkward. Perkins brought an emotional fragility to the role that made audiences uncomfortable in a completely new way. But the success of Psycho came with a cost. Hollywood suddenly stopped seeing him as a versatile actor and started seeing him as Norman Bates. He struggled with typecasting for years afterward. Even when he gave excellent performances in other films, the shadow of Psycho followed him everywhere.
Listen, if you don't believe me, come on with me. You can help me change bets, okay?
Okay, oh. No, thanks.
There's a cruel irony there. The role that gave him immortality also narrowed his career. And because Norman Bates became associated with repression, hidden identity, and psychological torment, some writers and critics unfairly projected those ideas onto Perkins himself. Hollywood has always had a tendency to blur actors with the characters they play, and Perkins carried that burden for decades.
Right.
In the case of Psycho, it could happen next door. That was Hitchcock's contention. This story could happen about your neighbors and about you and about your family.
In later years, Perkins married photographer and actress Barry Berenson and had 2 sons. To the public, it looked like he had finally settled into a traditional Hollywood family life. But biographers and friends have suggested that his internal struggles never completely disappeared. Some accounts describe him as deeply lonely despite his fame. Others describe him as funny, warm, artistic, and incredibly intelligent, someone people genuinely loved being around. That's what makes stories like his complicated. He wasn't simply miserable all the time. He experienced love, friendship, creativity, and success. But underneath it all was decades of repression and fear that never fully left him.
You were expecting me.
Well, I was expecting someone. I just wasn't sure when. Tea?
Oh, please.
Then came the AIDS crisis, one of the darkest periods in queer history. By the 1980s and early 1990s, AIDS was devastating entire communities, while governments, media outlets, and many public figures responded with cruelty, silence, or outright homophobia. When Perkins was diagnosed with HIV, the stigma surrounding the disease was overwhelming. Many celebrities hid their diagnoses because public disclosure could lead to humiliation and isolation. Perkins kept his illness private for years. When he died in 1992 from AIDS-related complications, the reaction from the public carried a layer of tragedy that feels impossible to ignore now. Here was a man who had spent so much of his life hiding, performing versions of himself for survival, only to die during a time when queer men were still being treated as disposable by much of society. His death became part of a larger story about Hollywood, secrecy, and the emotional damage caused by decades of enforced silence.
Are you good with other actors? Kind to other actors?
Yes, I am. I've endured certain indignities at the hands of certain directors that won't be named tonight, and...
Oh, go ahead, name them. Get it out.
And honestly, when you look back at Anthony Perkins today, it becomes clear that his life says a lot about old Hollywood itself. The industry loved queer artists as long as they stayed quiet. It profited from their talent, while forcing many of them into secrecy. Perkins wasn't the only victim of that system, but his story feels especially haunting because of the strange overlap between his real life and the lonely characters he became famous for playing. What's beautiful, though, is that younger audiences today often see him differently. Not as a scandal or a tragic stereotype, but as a deeply talented queer artist who survived an incredibly oppressive era. And when people revisit Psycho now, there's an added layer of sadness knowing the man behind Norman Bates was carrying his own invisible fears the entire time.
Thank you for being here. Anthony Perkins, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back.
Thanks for watching the Pride Channel, where queer voices, history, and pop culture take center stage. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications